Hey there, survivors. Thanks for tuning in to tonight's episode. If you're new here, please consider subscribing. It really helps me keep these stories coming. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now let's get started. I don't remember the last time my name mattered. Maybe it did once, back when people still introduced themselves, back when names carried weight. But now I'm just another voice in the dark, another survivor clutching onto the remnants of a world that's crumbling by the hour. I've been hiding in a small concrete-walled basement ever since the worst of this global crisis began. I'm speaking into a radio transmitter that somehow still picks up signals from out there, what remains of the outside world. You might be listening to these words from your own cramped shelter, or perhaps you're out in the open, searching for answers and a sense of hope. Wherever you are, I want you to know that I understand your fear. I can feel it through every crackle and hiss of static, just as you likely feel mine in each trembling breath I take. We once believed that nuclear retaliation, a final apocalyptic measure, could halt the zombie virus. Maybe we thought it could burn out the infection zones so thoroughly that nothing could survive there, let alone walk. But now, we know that reality plays out differently from our theories. The bombs have fallen, yet the undead roam. The virus remains ceaseless, unstoppable. And that is the world you and I share now. What follows is my account. Part diary, part confession, and part broadcast. I've done my best to piece together day-by-day recollections and intercepted radio transmissions to create a cohesive narrative of how everything collapsed and how nuclear fire failed to cleanse our planet of this terrifying infection. I suppose it began with whispers that spread like wildfire across social media. Nothing the mainstream news would confirm initially. People shared strange clips of individuals acting erratically in the streets, shuffling with blank stares and pale complexions. Rumors swirled of a virus so potent that it not only induced fevers and delirium, but turned its victims into monstrous shells of their former selves. We had all seen enough movies to label such stories as zombie rumors. Late that evening, I was at my kitchen table, finishing a simple dinner. My television hummed in the background, the local news anchor adopting a grave tone I had never heard them use before. Authorities are investigating reports of violent behavior spreading across multiple areas. While we cannot confirm the exact nature of the illness involved, the public is urged to remain vigilant. More details will follow as they become available. I remember staring at the screen, a fork frozen in midair, goosebumps forming on my arms. The phrase violent behavior felt too mild for what I was seeing in those unverified online videos, but it was enough to make me uneasy. As soon as the broadcast ended, I switched off the TV and turned on my old shortwave radio, hoping for more clarity. Static filled the room. After scanning the frequencies for several minutes, I caught a flickering station. We are receiving scattered reports of possible infection clusters in at least 3 different countries. Symptoms include extreme aggression, a notable lack of rational thought, and intense cravings. Witnesses have described them as zombie-like behaviors. There it was, the word zombie, stated plainly. I let out a nervous laugh, unsure whether to treat it as a shock tactic or a literal fact. That night, I slept restlessly, half convinced it was some elaborate hoax. Morning brought a surreal normalcy. The sun rose over quiet streets, and people went to work as usual, though a strange tension permeated every interaction. News outlets began picking up the story, each offering vague confirmations of an emergent virus. Governments worldwide advised calm, repeating the need for good hygiene and immediate medical attention for anyone feeling ill. Yet no one outright called it a zombie virus. I tried my best to go about my daily routine, but I couldn't shake the apprehension. The shortwave radio stayed on in the background while I brewed coffee. That's when a frantic message came through. Anyone picking this up in the downtown area, you need to get off the streets now. They're not stopping. My entire block is getting attacked by these infected. The broadcast ended abruptly, replaced by squealing static. I nearly dropped my mug, heart pounding. I snatched up my coat and prepared to leave my house, though I had no idea where I would go. It felt crazy to stay put, but it also felt insane to venture out if some unknown threat roamed the streets. Ultimately, I decided on a middle ground. Gather supplies at home, then see if the authorities provided any official guidance. That day, the transmissions grew more urgent. Report after report described neighborhoods overrun by people who no longer acted like people at all. They were described as shambling, biting, and feverish. The word zombie cropped up repeatedly, though official sources avoided it. A quiet panic simmered beneath the veneer of normal life. By sunset, I sealed my doors and windows with old boards and prayed that this was a nightmare that would pass swiftly. By the third day, we knew this wasn't going away. Every radio station I tuned into featured emergency instructions, urging everyone to remain in their homes if possible. The virus, now openly referred to as a zombie infection by some smaller broadcasters, seemed unstoppable. Local authorities tried to set up containment zones around heavily affected areas, but it was like setting up a picket fence to hold back a tsunami. This is the civil alert system. Due to rising cases of the zombie virus in urban centers, we advise all citizens to stay indoors. Lock and secure all entry points. Do not engage with infected individuals as they are highly dangerous. The situation remains fluid. Stay tuned for further instructions. I remember feeling a sense of dread that settled like lead in my stomach. If we were being told not to engage the infected, that meant the authorities had lost control over large swaths of the city. Indeed, the city was devolving into chaos. Social media showed videos of empty storefronts, abandoned cars on highways, and lines of desperate people trying to flee. That evening, I heard the sound of gunfire in the distance. It was sporadic, but it confirmed that my corner of the world was teetering on the edge of open conflict. Before going to bed, I pushed my couch against the front door, hoping it might slow down any unwanted visitors, infected or otherwise. Early on day 4, something unusual happened. An emergency announcement from a high-ranking government official broadcast across nearly every station. My fellow citizens, we face an unprecedented threat. The infection has reached critical levels in multiple regions. We are coordinating with international allies to deploy containment protocols. Effective immediately, certain areas will be under martial law. We ask everyone to comply with safety regulations. Together we can overcome this crisis. I listened to every word, wondering how they could possibly contain something spreading so fast, especially when no known cure existed. The broadcast ended with a repeated line, "Remain calm. Help is coming." But nobody I knew believed that promise. Over the course of the day, my radio picked up more dire updates. Entire towns were sealing themselves off, roads were blocked, travel was heavily restricted. The sense of isolation intensified. My own water supply started to sputter, and electricity flickered ominously. I suspected that the utility workers had either fled or succumbed to the infection. By nightfall, the hum of the city's lights dimmed, leaving an unsettling darkness across the skyline. On the 5th day, I attempted a short trip outside to see if I could find additional supplies. The streets were surreal. Abandoned cars lined the curbs, some with doors hanging open, as if people had leapt out and run in terror. Here and there, I spotted dark red stains on the pavement. My mind recoiled from the implications. Thankfully, I didn't encounter any infected during that brief outing, but the stillness in the air felt heavier than any crowd I had ever known. I made it to a small corner store, rummaged around for canned goods, water bottles, and anything else that seemed useful. The store had been partially looted, but I found enough to fill a backpack. On the way back, a faint moaning sound echoed from an alley. I froze, scanning the shadows. A figure slumped against the wall, twitching in a manner that was entirely unnatural. It lifted its head and looked at me. Its eyes were sunken, its skin pale and stretched tight across its face. A chill raced up my spine. I quietly stepped away, careful not to make noise, and hurried back home. Once safe inside, I barricaded the door again and turned on my radio. After a long stretch of static, a voice cut through. Reports confirmed that the infection is no longer contained. Many cities are overrun. If you are receiving this broadcast, your best chance of survival is to remain hidden, stockpile essentials, and avoid contact with infected. The virus is spread by bites, scratches, and possibly airborne particles in proximity to the infected. We are doing our best to verify these details. Stand by for official guidance. Anxious questions buzzed in my brain. Could these creatures break through boarded windows or locked doors? Would the virus spread through the air, or was it only direct contact? No one seemed to know. All we had was fear and speculation. As governments scrambled to coordinate, a handful of scientists took to the airwaves in an attempt to share new findings. By day 6, I started hearing more technical language, terms like rapid mutation, unprecedented viral load, neurological reanimation. One broadcast came from a small research lab that was apparently still operational. We have analyzed samples from infected individuals. The virus exhibits characteristics similar to certain parasitic fungi and advanced neurotropic diseases. It hijacks the host's motor functions and basic survival instincts, effectively reducing higher cognitive processes to near zero. The infected exhibit relentless pursuit of uninfected hosts. This is hypothesized to be a viral propagation mechanism. While we remain hopeful a medical solution can be found, the current environment makes further research difficult. Listening to this, I felt a spark of grim fascination. A virus that hijacks the brain so thoroughly that it reanimates the body. It sounded like the stuff of folklore, but here we were, living it. This was no movie. The uncertainty pressed down on me, thick as any physical weight. By the end of the first week, transmissions from various military sources hinted at talk of extreme measures to curb the global spread. At first, these mentions were veiled. Containment using advanced methods. Potential for large-scale neutralization. But it didn't take long for the unthinkable to crystallize into plain language. Nuclear retaliation. Unconfirmed reports suggest discussions at the highest levels about the deployment of nuclear warheads to eradicate heavily infected zones. Authorities have neither confirmed nor denied these rumors, but we advise all listeners to prepare for worst-case scenarios. If nuclear strikes are indeed approved, radiation hazards will add another layer of danger. I stared at my radio in disbelief. The idea that someone would authorize nuclear strikes on their own soil, or anywhere on Earth, to combat this infection was too horrifying to process. Yet in the face of a virus that was decimating entire regions, I understood the desperation. Fear took on a new edge that night. If the bombs fell, would I be safe in my basement, or would I meet the same fate as those in the blast zones? Morning light brought more frantic broadcasts from across the world. Transmissions from different continents described eerily similar scenes. Cities under siege by the infected, medical facilities inundated with patients, entire neighborhoods cordoned off. The word apocalypse began to be used openly. The infection was everywhere, it seemed. Civilization was fracturing. This is a joint statement from allied nations. Multiple governments have declared states of emergency. Some are invoking protocols to deploy unprecedented military force. We are coordinating to share information regarding potential nuclear retaliation on a limited scale, with the goal of halting the zombie infection in the most critical zones. We understand the gravity of these actions. More details to follow. There it was, plain as day. No more rumors. Nuclear weapons were officially on the table. The language was stoic and clinical, but the underlying message was one of sheer terror. If quarantines and conventional methods fail, entire cities might be wiped off the map. My radio crackled with static for a solid minute after that announcement, as if the airwaves themselves were too stunned to speak. By now, my food and water were dwindling. The radio news made it clear that staying in a major city was a recipe for disaster, especially if it might become a nuclear target. I packed what I could into a sturdy backpack. Canned goods, water bottles, a flashlight, batteries, a small first aid kit, and some warm clothing. My plan was half-formed. Head for the outskirts, away from large infection clusters, and hope to find a safer place to ride out the chaos. I ventured outside at dawn. The sky was a dull grey, thick with a haze that smelled like smoke and decay. The once busy streets were deserted except for abandoned vehicles and scattered debris. Windows in many buildings were shattered, and doors hung off their hinges. Strange messages were spray-painted on walls. Stay away. Infected inside. Help us. Each step felt like I was walking deeper into a nightmare. About an hour into my journey, I heard a rustling sound from a nearby alley. I froze, heart pounding. A single infected person stumbled out, their clothes torn and face drawn. They caught sight of me and let out an inhuman moan, hobbling forward with increasing speed. My instincts screamed for me to run. I dashed down the nearest side street, weaving between cars and overturned trash bins. I didn't look back until I felt certain I was alone. In those precious seconds, all my illusions about being prepared vanished. I wasn't ready to face the infected. I was just an ordinary person trying to survive. I found temporary refuge in an old, boarded-up hardware store. Inside, it was dark and stale, but empty. I took the moment to catch my breath and scan for supplies. Luckily, I found a few useful items: rope, duct tape, and a crowbar. My radio crackled as I leaned against the counter to rest. Attention, citizens. This is the Global Defense Council. We have confirmed that the infection has spread to nearly every region worldwide. Efforts to contain the outbreak using standard quarantine measures have proven insufficient. Military forces are regrouping, and some have begun preparing large-scale strikes. We will continue broadcasting updates. Remain indoors unless evacuation is absolutely necessary. At that, I realized I was directly defying the advice. Remain indoors. But my old indoors was no longer safe. I decided to push onward, convinced that if a nuclear strike was coming, it would likely target more densely populated zones than the outskirts. On the 10th day, the tone of every broadcast changed. A cold finality crept into the voices on the radio. It was as if the entire planet collectively held its breath. The following statement comes from the highest international authorities. After careful deliberation, it has been decided that nuclear retaliation is the final option to save humanity from the zombie virus. Strikes will be authorized in key hotspots to destroy infected populations. We urge all citizens in designated impact zones to evacuate if at all possible. Additional information will be provided regarding safe routes and bunkers. May we find mercy in these dark times. I was holed up in the hardware store when I heard that. My chest tightened, and tears blurred my vision. Nuclear bombs on our own cities. The concept was too enormous to fully comprehend. I had no illusions of personal safety. Even if the blasts were hundreds of miles away, the fallout could reach me. And what about survivors trapped in those hot spots? My radio caught snippets of pleas from people in heavily infected areas, begging for help. Each frantic voice was like a dagger to the heart. As the countdown began for the impending strikes, sirens wailed across many regions. Some were air raid sirens, others civil defense alarms. Even far from the main city centers, I heard faint echoes of them on the wind. My plan was to keep moving, to find a more remote area. I had an old map and chose a path that skirted the edges of suburban sprawl, aiming for farmland and forest. Walking alone along a cracked highway, I tuned my radio to any frequency that might give me a sense of the timing. All forces, prepare for nuclear deployment. The schedule is set for T-6 hours, repeating T-6 hours until the first wave of strikes. If you are in a designated danger zone, evacuate immediately or seek underground shelter. This is not a test. I swallowed hard. 6 hours. I wondered about the people who didn't have time to leave or had nowhere else to go. As the sun sank below the horizon, I felt the weight of that ticking clock. Each step away from the city felt both necessary and overwhelmingly tragic. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I took shelter in an abandoned motel on the edge of a rural highway. The place was silent, except for a leaking faucet that dripped rhythmically, echoing in the hollow corridors. I kept my radio at my side, volume turned low so I wouldn't miss a single update. Shortly after midnight, transmissions confirmed the unthinkable. We confirm that the first wave of nuclear retaliation has commenced. Multiple missiles launched from Allied bases have struck critical infection zones. Casualty figures are unknown. Fallout advisories are in effect. All civilians in adjacent areas must shelter immediately and await further instructions. We repeat, the first wave is complete. I felt the motel walls tremble. Maybe it was just my imagination, or perhaps the distant quaking of the earth from those massive detonations. For hours I sat there, huddled in the dark, picturing mushroom clouds rising over cities I once knew. Morning light found me slumped against a wall, half awake. My body ached and my mind buzzed with worry. I flicked on the radio, desperate for news. Initial assessments indicate severe destruction in the targeted regions. However, it remains unclear if the infected have been fully eradicated. Preliminary visuals suggest ongoing movement in areas adjacent to the blast zones. We are advising caution, as radiation levels are extremely high. Further strikes may be considered if the infection persists. They did it. They dropped bombs on our own soil. Yet the broadcast hinted that the infection might still be present. I couldn't fathom how anything could survive such an onslaught. But then again, this virus had already defied every boundary of scientific logic. That day, I continued to move farther into the countryside. Occasional far-off booms rattled the sky, possibly delayed secondary strikes or localized ordnance. Or maybe something else entirely. I didn't want to dwell on it. My priority was finding safe shelter and some source of clean water. By day 14, the environment was noticeably different. A fine dust seemed to hang in the air, obscuring the horizon. I coughed more often, and my eyes stung. The radio crackled with warnings. Attention survivors. Fallout zones have been confirmed in multiple regions. If you must travel, do so with protective gear. Prolonged exposure can be lethal. Infected have been sighted walking through irradiated areas. They appear unaffected by radiation sickness. We do not yet have an explanation for this phenomenon. The idea of radiation-immune infected made my blood run cold. The bombs were supposed to destroy them, or at the very least slow them down. Instead, we now had the same walking horrors in radioactive clouds. It felt like the planet was uninhabitable for all but these terrifying reanimated figures. I reached a stretch of highway that cut through empty farmland. Broken fences and abandoned tractors hinted at how hastily people must have fled. A sign read, "Next town, 30 miles." I sighed, shoulders slumping at the long trek ahead. My radio offered little comfort. The second wave of nuclear strikes has been confirmed. Additional bombs have been detonated in previously identified infection clusters. We still lack evidence that this measure is eradicating the virus. Satellite imagery shows continued movement of infected populations around blast perimeters. I paused to contemplate the scale of it. Not one, but multiple waves of nuclear strikes, each one failing to fully neutralize the threat. If nuclear fire couldn't stop the virus, what else could humanity do? I pressed onward, each step heavier than the last. My backpack weighed more in my mind than on my shoulders. That night, as dusk fell, I found a small wooded area off the highway. I decided it was as good a place as any to make camp. Surrounded by tall trees, I built a modest fire with dried branches. The flickering flames offered a pocket of warmth and light in the gloom. I switched on my radio, scanning for any sign of hope. Against all odds, a faint signal emerged. "Hello? This is a broadcast from a small survivor group off Route 19. We have food, water, and some ammunition. If you can reach us, we'll share what we can. We're not sure how long we can hold out, but for now, we're safe. We'll transmit coordinates continuously on this frequency." My heart fluttered. People, real, living people, still out there, still willing to help. I scribbled down the coordinates they mentioned. It might be a detour, but if it meant possibly finding allies and supplies, it could be worth it. Before I could finalize my plans, the broadcast crackled again, interrupted by a frantic voice. "They're here! Everyone, get your weapons! No, there are too many! We can't—" Silence. My face fell. Whatever hope that tiny group represented vanished in seconds. I sat by the fire until it burned down to embers, feeling the sting of tears. This was the new reality, fleeting beacons of hope, consumed almost immediately by the relentless spread of the undead. The next day brought a lull in significant radio updates. I walked aimlessly, lost in thought, recalling memories from before the outbreak, times I used to meet friends for coffee, or sit in a crowded park on a sunny afternoon. The sheer normalcy of those moments felt like a distant dream. I found myself replaying the day's biggest question. How had the virus spread so fast that entire countries seemed overrun in a matter of weeks? Some speculated it began in a hidden lab. Others claimed it was ancient, thawed from melting ice. There were conspiracies too, rogue groups engineering it, or accidental leaks from top-secret facilities. None of that mattered now, though, because no explanation could undo the apocalypse. That evening, my radio beeped in an irregular pattern, indicating a weak broadcast. "This is Dr. Romero, broadcasting from an undisclosed laboratory. Our preliminary data suggest the zombie infection can survive extreme conditions. Radiation does not appear to slow the virus at all. Test subjects remain active even in lethal doses of fallout. I fear we have underestimated the virus's resilience. We are pursuing alternative solutions, but require more time." The broadcast cut out. Dr. Romero's words hammered home the finality. Nuclear bombs didn't even weaken the infection. I sat there under the open sky, weighed down by the question, if nukes couldn't stop it, what could? I decided to venture further off the beaten path, leaving the highway behind. Maybe the infected stuck mainly to areas once populated. The wilderness might offer better odds of avoiding them. Hours of trudging through brush and forest brought me to a small stream. I drank from it cautiously, unsure about contamination levels, but thirst was too pressing a concern. A sharp crackle on the radio jarred me out of my exhaustion. To all survivors, due to the failure of repeated nuclear strikes to halt the zombie outbreak, the remaining leadership is considering alternative measures. We urge communities to establish local defenses, share resources, and avoid traveling in large groups. The global situation is dire. Stay alert. Hearing the phrase remaining leadership hammered home how fractured the world had become. Everything was improvised now. No single government, no unified plan. The bombs had dropped, yet the apocalypse continued. Deep into the forest, I encountered my first infected in days. It caught me by surprise. I had let my guard down, lulled by the relative quiet. The figure stumbled between trees, clothes torn and skin pallid, its eyes vacant and hungry. Our gazes locked, and it let out a drawn-out groan that froze my blood. I reacted on instinct. Grabbing the crowbar from my belt, I forced myself not to panic. As it lunged, I dodged sideways, heart hammering. Then I swung the crowbar with all my might. The figure toppled, but kept moving. A second blow, and it finally lay still. Gasping, I wiped cold sweat from my forehead. I hated the violence, hated the terror, but in this world, it was survival or surrender. Shaking from the encounter, I found a safe spot among thick bushes to hide and collect my thoughts. My hands wouldn't stop trembling. After a few moments, I turned on the radio, seeking any voice that might ground me. We have received multiple confirmations that infected are roaming outside urban zones, including rural and forested areas. Even nuclear fallout zones have not deterred their spread. Survivors must remain vigilant no matter where you are. The zombie virus shows no sign of weakening. I exhaled slowly, absorbing that grim update. There was no true safe place. Not the city, not the countryside, not even the forests. Hope can arrive in the strangest ways. On day 20, I unexpectedly crossed paths with another human being, a young woman named Elise, ragged and exhausted, but alive. We nearly attacked each other out of sheer fear, but once we realized we were both uninfected, relief washed over us. Elise had a small hand-crank radio, which she used sparingly to save energy. We shared stories by a small campfire. She had been on the run since day 3, after losing her family in the chaos. My heart broke at the sadness in her eyes. Later that evening, we listened to her radio together. This is an open broadcast from the Northern Coalition. We have created a series of checkpoints in mountainous regions to protect against large-scale zombie incursions. Supplies are limited, but if you can reach us, we will do our best to provide shelter. Be warned, the roads are perilous, and nuclear fallout has contaminated certain passes. Elise and I exchanged glances. Neither of us had a solid plan beyond stay alive. The thought of reaching a checkpoint, somewhere guarded, with potential allies, sparked a tiny flame of hope. We agreed to head north together at first light. The next morning we set off toward the coordinates broadcast by the Northern Coalition. It was a multi-day journey on foot, through rough terrain. We had no vehicle and the roads were choked with wreckage anyway. With each step, I wondered if the Northern Coalition even still existed, or if their checkpoint had already fallen. We chatted occasionally to keep our spirits up. Elise told me how, when the outbreak first hit, she never imagined it could become global. She thought it was a passing scare, like so many overblown crises in the media. But once the first wave of nuclear strikes happened, she realized there was no going back. Just before dusk, our radios picked up another general announcement. Alert! Additional nuclear strikes are planned for infected dense regions across several continents. Ground intel suggests the infection is spreading faster than predicted. We cannot guarantee the safety of any region, including remote areas. Prepare for further fallout advisories. Elise and I locked eyes. The bombs were still falling, or soon would be. This realization pushed us to move faster, ignoring our fatigue. If we didn't reach safety soon, we risked being caught in the new wave of nuclear retaliation or the next wave of infected. By day 22, we glimpsed the first mountain foothills on the horizon. Our journey had been grueling. Our water was running low, and fresh supplies were nearly impossible to find. Abandoned cabins sometimes yielded canned goods, but it was a gamble each time to explore a building that might be occupied by the infected. Late in the day, we turned on the radio again, hoping for updates on the Northern Coalition. Attention, travelers heading north. We are aware of escalating nuclear measures. Our checkpoints remain operational, but we cannot guarantee rescue beyond our perimeter. If you choose to approach, follow the marked trail near the abandoned ranger station. Prepare for security checks to verify you are not infected. Safe travels. It was the first detailed instruction we'd heard. A flicker of optimism returned. If they were still broadcasting, then maybe they were still holding on. Elise and I discussed our plan. Find the ranger station, follow the marked trail, and hope we weren't too late. Night found us camping under a rocky overhang, shielded from the worst of the wind. The temperature dropped sharply. We huddled in sleeping bags, taking turns keeping watch for infected or other dangers. Around midnight, while Elise dozed, I heard a faint moan echo among the towering pines. Stepping carefully, I circled our camp's perimeter. The moonlight revealed silhouettes lurching through the trees. 2, maybe 3 infected. My pulse thundered in my ears. I woke Elise with a gentle nudge. We doused our small fire, praying the darkness would conceal us. The infected drew closer, their low groans sending dread through every nerve. We clutched our makeshift weapons, my crowbar and her sturdy wooden plank. Miraculously, the infected shuffled past our hiding spot without noticing us, stumbling deeper into the woods. Once their moans faded, Elise and I exhaled in unison. It was a small reminder. The undead were everywhere. Even out here in the wilderness, we had to remain vigilant. The morning sun brought clearer skies, unveiling the majestic peaks ahead. Our spirits lifted at the sight, though we remained wary. By midday, we found the ranger station mentioned in the broadcast. a wooden structure with broken windows, perched at the foot of a winding mountain trail. The station was half collapsed, likely ransacked by both desperate survivors and the infected. We rummaged carefully, discovering a faded map pinned to a wall. A red marker indicated a trail leading higher into the mountains, labeled Coalition Post. Perfect. We also found some half-full water bottles and a few protein bars in a locked cabinet. Small miracles that could sustain us a bit longer. While studying the map, a shortwave transmission popped up. If you are at the ranger station, follow the trail with caution. We have seen roaming infected along the path. Keep your radio tuned to this frequency for any updates. We will fire a flare at dusk to guide lost travelers. We exchanged determined nods. This was our best shot at finding safety, however temporary. Gathering our things, we set off along the marked trail. Ascending the mountain proved treacherous. Fallen trees and mudslides blocked parts of the trail, forcing us to detour or climb over obstacles. We stayed alert for infected, but encountered none during daylight. Perhaps the rugged terrain deterred them, or maybe we were just lucky. Halfway up, our radio crackled with an alarming update. Unconfirmed sightings of mutated infected have emerged from high radiation areas. These infected display increased endurance and appear unfazed by wounds that would normally be incapacitating. If you encounter them, exercise extreme caution. No known method has proven effective at stopping them short of destroying the brain. Elise and I paused, minds racing. Had the nuclear fallout created even more resilient variants? The idea was horrifying. We silently agreed to move faster. If these mutated infected were real, the mountains might not remain safe for long. Dusk approached. We had covered a good distance but still saw no signs of the Coalition post. The trail's switchbacks seemed endless. Exhaustion gnawed at our bones. Then, a bright red flare arced into the evening sky, briefly illuminating the rugged landscape. We exchanged excited glances. That had to be the signal mentioned in the broadcast. Quickening our pace, we trudged onward in the flare's direction. We found an outcropping of rocks overlooking a small valley. Down below, nestled among the trees, sat a ring of lights, a fenced encampment. We had found it. A wave of relief washed over us, followed immediately by caution. What if we were walking into a trap, or a site that had just fallen to the infected? The radio chirped right on cue. We have spotted movement on the ridgeline. If you are survivors, proceed down the path. We will meet you at the gate. Remain calm and show no signs of infection. We are heavily armed. That final warning made me shiver, but Elise and I followed instructions. Soon, we arrived at a sturdy chain-link fence topped with barbed wire. A couple of tense guards aimed flashlights at us, their rifles held ready. They asked us standard questions. Have you been bitten? Have you shown any symptoms? When was your last contact with infected? We answered honestly, and after a brief inspection, they motioned us inside. Inside the Coalition post, we found around 30 survivors, men, women, and a few young people. They'd set up tents and a makeshift command center powered by a generator. It was the most organized operation I'd seen since the outbreak. Elise and I were assigned a small patch of ground near a campfire. We gratefully accepted bowls of soup and half-stale bread. For the first time in weeks, we felt almost normal, surrounded by others talking in low voices, sharing stories of survival. That evening, the camp's leader, a former military officer named Grant, gathered everyone around for a briefing. He wore a weary expression. Folks, we've all heard the news. Nuclear strikes have failed to stop this zombie infection. We've seen mutated infected out there. Our plan is to maintain this camp as long as possible. We have some supplies and basic defenses, but we need to stay vigilant. If you're armed, we can use your help on perimeter watches. Remember, we only survive if we stand together. A ripple of agreement spread through the crowd. For the first time in a long while, I felt a tiny glimmer of genuine hope. The next morning, Elise and I volunteered for a scouting mission. A small team would check a nearby cave system for potential resources, especially clean water. Grant stressed that the infected might be lurking anywhere, especially with rumors of them adapting to harsh conditions. We set off at dawn, traveling light. The cave entrance was a mile or so from the camp. Inside, darkness swallowed us, interrupted only by our flashlight's narrow beams. The air was damp and cool. We soon discovered a trickle of water flowing through a series of low passages. With proper filtration, it might be a clean source. Suddenly, a noise made us freeze. A scraping sound echoed from deeper in the cave, followed by a raspy moan. Adrenaline surged. One of our scouts whispered, "Infected," and we backed away slowly. The moaning grew louder, closer. Our flashlights revealed two figures shuffling towards us, their silhouettes jerking unnaturally. We tried to move quietly, but one of our members slipped on wet stone, clattering to the ground. The infected hissed and lunged forward. In the confined space, panic erupted. Elise swung her plank, striking one infected in the head. I used my crowbar on the other. Within seconds, both lay still, but we heard more moaning echoing through the tunnel. Realizing we were outnumbered, we grabbed a quick water sample and retreated. No additional infected pursued us outside, but the incident confirmed that danger was everywhere, even in hidden caves. Upon returning to camp, we handed over the water sample. A volunteer with rudimentary lab equipment said they'd test it. Meanwhile, Elise and I took much-needed rest in our tent. That night, while many in the camp slept, I turned on my radio. In the stillness, a faint voice emerged. "This is an automated broadcast from the Eastern Safe Haven. We have established a fortified zone with robust defenses. Any survivors able to reach our location will be offered medical aid, food, and housing. Be advised, nuclear fallout has impacted travel routes. Current location transmissions are approximate due to GPS failure." I jotted down the approximate coordinates. The Eastern Safe Haven was far from our mountainous region, perhaps halfway across the continent. But hearing about another refuge made me wonder if there might be a network of enclaves. Would the coalition post eventually link up with them? I also wondered if this safe haven was truly functional or just another half-doomed outpost holding on by a thread. Either way, the possibility was comforting, a sign that not everyone had given up. In the morning, we gathered around a battery-powered radio in the camp's command area. A static-filled transmission caught everyone's attention, appealing to any functioning laboratory or research center. We must collaborate to understand why nuclear retaliation failed to stop the zombie virus. Preliminary data suggests a robust viral structure capable of withstanding high radiation levels. We suspect the infected themselves may be acting as hosts for mutated strains, possibly fortifying the virus. If you have the means to communicate, please reach out. Our resources are limited. Grant, Elise, and I exchanged grim looks. If Dr. Romero was correct, then nuclear bombs didn't just fail. They might have facilitated the virus in creating more resilient forms. The camp was silent, each person grappling with the magnitude of this revelation. With the camp's future at stake, we threw ourselves into strengthening defenses. We dug trenches, reinforced the fences, and set up tripwire alarms around the perimeter. A group of skilled sharpshooters organized rotating patrols. Elise and I were put on supply duty. We scavenged in nearby cabins and outbuildings, gathering anything that could be of use. Canned food, tools, even old mattresses for more comfortable bedding. The presence of multiple people working together felt refreshing, yet a somber undercurrent persisted. We all knew how fragile this sanctuary was. That night, we received a short wave from a station in the south. "If you're hearing this, we advise steering clear of major roads. We've encountered roving hordes of zombies migrating outward from destroyed cities. It seems the nuclear blasts pushed them into surrounding regions. Travel only in small groups, keep noise to a minimum, and never let your guard down." We relayed this to Grant, who nodded solemnly. The nuclear blasts hadn't contained the infected. They had simply dispersed them, scattering them across the land like seeds in the wind. Our safe patch of mountains might soon see even more undead wandering through. The next day, everything changed. A perimeter guard spotted a large group of infected approaching from the south. The camp erupted into controlled chaos. Everyone scrambled to their battle stations, checking weapons and bracing for impact. I joined Elise at a watchtower made of stacked crates. From our vantage point, we saw them, dozens of infected shambling up the slope, moaning in unison. Some were missing limbs or had scorched clothing, suggesting they'd been near a bomb site. Yet they still moved, grim testament to the virus's resilience. Grant ordered warning shots, hoping to slow their advance. Gunfire cracked the air. A few infected fell, but the horde kept coming. Fear roiled in my stomach. I had fought off single infected before, but never faced such numbers. The horde reached our outer fence. Metal rattled under their collective weight. We aimed downward and struck at any arms that tried to climb over. The noise was deafening. Rifles firing, people shouting, infected moaning. Despite our best efforts, a section of fence began to give way. My palms sweated as I braced for the worst. Suddenly, an explosion rocked the hillside. One of the camp's scouts had rigged improvised devices to detonate near the fence. Chunks of earth and debris rained down, tearing through the front line of infected. Smoke billowed, forcing me to cough and shield my eyes. When the dust settled, I saw scattered limbs twitching. The fence was damaged, but most of the horde had been reduced to still forms on the ground. We spent the rest of the afternoon disposing of the remains, ensuring none were still a threat. A thick, acrid smell hung over the camp. Though we survived, we all understood. This was just the beginning. In the aftermath, the camp was a somber place. Some of our group were injured. We patched them up as best we could, but we lacked proper medical supplies. Elise and I took rotating shifts, watching for any new approach of infected. Everyone felt the same weary gloom. If one horde could find us, others could too. That evening, the radio brought another sobering update. Widespread nuclear retaliation has left entire regions uninhabitable due to radiation, yet the infected traverse these zones unscathed. Multiple safe zones have reported horde attacks following blasts. We are urging survivors to think strategically. Use the terrain, fortify your positions, and prepare for extended sieges. It felt like a thundercloud of doom settled over our camp. The message confirmed what we already knew. The nuclear attacks were failing, and the hordes were now scattered across every corner of the map. Grant called a meeting around the central fire pit. He announced his plan. Half the camp would stay put, fortifying the post further, while the other half would venture out to search for resources and gather intelligence on the infected's movements. Elise and I volunteered for the scouting group again, though fear churned in our stomachs at the thought of leaving the relative security of the camp. Before we departed, Grant spoke quietly to us. "Look, I won't sugarcoat it. This is a dire situation. If nuclear strikes haven't done the job, we're dealing with something beyond comprehension. But we have each other, and that's worth fighting for. Good luck out there." We nodded, collecting our gear. The sincerity in his words steadied our resolve. Despite the swirling chaos of the world, we had formed a small, determined community. Perhaps that was how humanity would endure, through small pockets of cooperation. Our scouting party followed a winding mountain road heading east, hoping to gather data on any infected movements and to possibly contact the rumored eastern safe haven. For 2 days, we encountered little besides quiet forests and occasional wildlife skittering through the underbrush. On the second evening of our trek, we made camp near a rocky ridge. We took turns sleeping. During my watch, I scanned the radio frequencies and stumbled upon a faint signal. To all survivors heading our way, we confirm heavy nuclear fallout in several adjacent regions. We cannot guarantee safe passage. Additionally, roving hordes have been spotted. We urge extreme caution. Our gates remain open for now. It sounded like they were still operational, but how long could they hold out? I jotted down the broadcast details and decided to share them with the others at dawn. Morning brought ominous clouds. As we continued eastward, a light drizzle began. Before long, the drizzle turned into a downpour, and our Geiger counters, a new addition we'd salvaged, started to click more frequently. Radioactive rain, likely stirred up by the repeated nuclear detonations. We had protective gear, but it wasn't ideal. We took shelter in a partially collapsed barn. The roof kept most of the rain out, and the walls, though damaged, offered some shielding. We set up tarps and huddled in a corner, listening to the relentless patter of radioactive droplets outside. Weather advisories. Radioactive storms expected to pass through multiple regions. Survivors should limit outdoor exposure. The zombie infection is reported to be active despite hazardous conditions. That last line underlined the horror of our predicament. The undead roamed freely, completely unaffected by conditions that were life-threatening to the rest of us. We spent the rest of the day waiting for the storm to subside, attempting to ration our dwindling food. The morning after the storm, the sky cleared somewhat, though a persistent grey haze lingered. We continued east until we stumbled upon a deserted medical facility built into the side of a mountain. The sign out front was battered, reading Westwood Research Institute. Hoping to find medical supplies or clues to the virus, we ventured inside. The interior was cold and smelled faintly of chemicals. Papers and broken equipment littered the floors. Deeper in, we found a lab with partially destroyed computers, as if someone had sabotaged them. Then, in a dark corridor, we discovered a small generator room with a locked door. After some effort, we managed to pry it open. Inside, we found a radio terminal and a scattering of journals. The journals contained research notes, many referencing the zombie virus. One cryptic entry read, "Subject 12 remains active despite maximum radiation exposure. Tissues show extreme resilience. This lines up with field reports that nuclear strikes are insufficient. Must continue testing. Running out of time." Shivers ran down my spine. Whoever was here had tried to find ways to kill the virus with radiation, but the virus won. A harsh reminder of just how tenacious this infection was. We left the facility feeling more disheartened than ever. Our quick search yielded almost no medical supplies. Whatever had been here was either used up or taken by others. Worse still, the notes we found confirmed that the infected were even harder to kill than we feared. Our scouting party convened to discuss next steps. Should we keep going east toward the rumored safe haven, or return to the coalition post with our findings? After some debate, we decided to push on a bit farther, rationalizing that we could turn back if we hit serious trouble. A part of me worried we were pushing our luck. Luck finally ran out. Not long after leaving the research facility, we came across a scene of carnage near a woodland path. Several vehicles blocked the narrow road, windows smashed, doors ajar. Bloody clothing and half-eaten food rations lay strewn about. Our group approached cautiously, weapons ready. Without warning, infected figures emerged from behind the cars. One had ragged flesh on its arms, a result of nuclear burns that didn't stop it from moving. Another seemed grotesquely bloated, stumbling forward. Our group formed a defensive line, shouting for them to back off, a pointless gesture we knew, but habit dies hard. The infected lunged. Gunshots rang out. We managed to take down several, but more poured out of the woods on either side. It was clear we were outnumbered. Our group leader yelled, "Retreat! Back!" We scrambled to form a fighting retreat, firing sporadically to slow the horde. A wave of pure panic threatened to overwhelm me. One infected came perilously close, forcing me to swing my crowbar with wild desperation. Somehow we escaped, though one of our scouts was bitten. We carried her as far as we could, but she grew feverish within the hour. Tears ran down her face as she said, "Don't. Let me turn." With trembling hands, we honored her request. The rest of that day passed in a blur of grief. Our illusions of progress shattered. The eastern road was swarming with undead. Disheartened and with fewer members than we started, we turned back toward the coalition post. Our trek was slow, weighted by sorrow and exhaustion. Along the way, the radio offered sporadic announcements of more nuclear strikes around the globe. Each broadcast felt like a broken record. Bombs fell, the infected endured. We have confirmation of continuing reanimation in newly bombed regions. Civilians are urged to avoid these zones at all costs. Repeat, nuclear measures have not neutralized the zombie outbreak. Radiation levels remain hazardous to human life, but do not deter the infected. By the time we neared the post, twilight cloaked the mountains. We worried about what we'd find upon our return. To our surprise and relief, the coalition post still stood. The fence was reinforced with logs and metal sheets. Guards patrolled the perimeter. They recognized us and waved us in. Inside, we found the atmosphere tense but functional. Grant greeted us with somber relief, especially when he saw we were short one member. We spent the rest of the day debriefing, sharing every detail of our journey. The group was shaken by the news of unstoppable infected and the repeated nuclear failures. Yet, despite these grim facts, the post was thriving as best it could. More survivors had arrived, bolstering numbers. Grant assembled a meeting in the largest tent, urging calm. We've just received intel suggesting there might be a research vessel off the coast that avoided the worst of the infection. They claim to have labs and are looking for samples to study. If we can get them the right data, maybe they can figure out a real solution, something that's not nuclear fire. It's a long shot, but we're desperate for any hope. He glanced around at our exhausted faces. Though uncertain, we recognized that in a hopeless world, any spark of possibility was worth chasing. Volunteers were needed to make a dangerous trip to the coastline. Elise and I exchanged a glance. We were torn. We'd barely survived the Eastern scouting mission, but the alternative was to do nothing while the undead multiplied around us. For the next day, the camp bustled with preparations. People sorted gear, collected potential virus samples from recent kills, a grim task, and mapped routes to the coast that might avoid the densest infected zones. The radio played continuously in the background, delivering bleak updates interspersed with rare glimpses of resilience. To anyone who can hear this, hold on. We know the bombs have failed. We know the infected roam in numbers. But pockets of survivors are out there, fighting for every inch. If you can link up with a group, do so. We must remain united in this dark time. Hearing that, I felt a swell of determination. Even though the apocalypse was raging, we weren't alone. Human spirit, battered as it was, still flickered. Our sense of urgency escalated when a perimeter guard reported a massive horde in the distance. We scrambled to fortify the camp once more. The group heading for the coast needed to leave immediately or risk being pinned down. Elise, Grant, and a few others grabbed their gear and prepared for departure. I joined them, though my heart thundered. We parted ways with the camp under tense circumstances. Half the people stayed behind to defend, while the rest of us set out for a mission that could change our collective fate or end in disaster. For nearly a week, we traveled across a patchwork of landscapes, burned forests, irradiated plains, small towns where crumbling buildings bore the marks of nuclear shockwaves. The living dead appeared sporadically, forcing us to fight or hide. Rainstorms periodically carried fallout, requiring us to find shelter whenever our Geiger counters spiked. We relied heavily on the radio for updates, though signals were increasingly unreliable. Sometimes we'd catch faint transmissions in languages we didn't understand, reminding us that this was truly global. No corner of the earth had been spared. Finally, the coastline came into view. Instead of a welcoming horizon, we saw wreckage, sunken ships near the shore, collapsed piers, and debris from bombs that might have been aimed at coastal cities. The air smelled of salt and decay. Using binoculars, we scanned for any sign of the research vessel. Nothing. Grant set up the radio, broadcasting on open channels. This is the Coalition expedition team requesting contact with the research vessel rumored to be in these waters. We have virus samples. Please respond. Over. We repeated that message for hours, pausing only to remain silent whenever we saw infected on the nearby beach. Night fell, and still no reply. We pitched a makeshift camp on a bluff overlooking the water, hearts heavy with doubt. Coalition team, we read you. We are off the coast, approximately 3 miles out, but our vessel's engine is compromised. We cannot reach the shore safely due to infected in the water and possible nuclear debris. If you can find a stable boat and bring the samples on board, we'll attempt to continue our research." A surge of excitement rippled through our group. The vessel existed, but reaching it was another matter. How to cross 3 miles of potentially infected waters, scattered with wreckage and radiation pockets. Grant wasted no time organizing a plan. We'd search for a functional or repairable boat along the coastline. Meanwhile, the captain would maintain radio contact and guide us to their location. We moved north along the shoreline, eventually finding a small marina with battered docks. Many boats were ruined, holes in their hulls, or half submerged. But after hours of combing through them, we found a somewhat intact fishing vessel beached on the sand. Its hull had a few dents, but it might be fixable. A sense of cautious hope took hold. If we could patch it up, we could attempt to sail out to the research vessel. We set to work immediately, scrounging parts from other wrecks, using our limited mechanical know-how to seal cracks and check the engine. The radio overhead. We're sending coordinates. Our position shifts slightly with the currents. We have limited fuel. Be aware that some infected have been seen drifting in the water, dead bodies that somehow still move. Proceed with extreme caution. Infected in the water. The mental image was nightmare fuel, but we had no choice if we wanted to deliver these samples and potentially help find a solution. Fixing the boat took longer than expected. 2 days of meticulous work, made harder by the looming threat of wandering infected. We posted guards on the beach, scanning for any sign of them. Occasionally we saw silhouettes on distant sandbars, stumbling aimlessly in the surf. Mercifully, none came close enough to threaten us directly. At one point, the radio hissed with urgent news. Additional nuclear launches reported. Targets include coastal cities with high infection rates. Fallout will likely spread across marine areas, jeopardizing sea travel. Mariners are warned to stay clear of coastal waters if possible. We exchanged worried glances. Nuclear bombs still dropping even now. Our window to reach the research vessel was shrinking. Finally, by sundown, we managed to get the fishing boat's engine sputtering to life. It wasn't perfect, but it might carry us 3 miles offshore. We loaded the boat carefully. Grant, Elise, and 3 others would board, along with the precious virus samples. The rest of our team would remain on shore to guard our land base. We said our anxious farewells, not knowing if we'd ever see each other again. The boat lurched as we pushed off from the sand. Soon we were cutting through the waves, a salty wind stinging our faces. I took the helm, focusing on the coordinates relayed by the research vessel. Halfway through the journey, we spotted debris floating in the water, broken planks, maybe from other ships. A pale arm jutted from the waves. Then it moved. Elise gasped as we realized it belonged to an infected, drifting among the wreckage. The creature clawed weakly at the air, moaning even with half its face submerged. We steered clear, hearts pounding. Eventually, a large silhouette emerged from the haze. The research vessel. Rusted but intact, it bobbed on the choppy sea. A handful of people waved at us from the deck. The radio crackled. "We see you. Approach the starboard side. We'll lower a ladder. Hurry. The infected in the water are increasing in number." We navigated carefully, avoiding clusters of floating debris and the occasional flailing infected. Once alongside the vessel, we tossed a rope for stability. One by one, we climbed aboard, the virus samples in a sealed case strapped to Grant's back. The ship's crew greeted us with both relief and urgency. The vessel's captain led us to a small lab. Several scientists crowded around, their faces etched with fatigue. They explained their mission. They'd fled a mainland lab when nuclear strikes started, taking critical research gear with them. They hoped the open sea might offer a safer environment for studying the virus. Dr. Solomon, a lead researcher, opened the case containing our samples. She grimaced at the sight of infected tissue. Then, with careful hands, she placed it under a microscope. "We've hypothesized that the virus has developed a protein shell that protects it from radiation damage. Your samples might confirm this. If we can isolate that protein, maybe we can develop a targeted agent to weaken the virus. It's a long shot, but it's better than endless nuclear bombings. My pulse quickened. This was the first real plan we'd heard that didn't involve massive explosions. Elise and Grant listened intently, nodding in agreement. We spent 2 days cooperating with the vessel's small crew. While they ran tests, we helped patch up the ship and looked for ways to improve engine reliability. Periodically, the captain updated us on the dire global situation via shortwave transmissions. Each day, more bombs fell, more infected spread, and more strongholds collapsed. But here, aboard this rusty research vessel, a sliver of optimism emerged. Dr. Solomon believed she might have identified a chemical compound that could disrupt the virus's protective shell, if only she had certain lab materials that were back on the mainland. A plan began to form. Retrieve those materials from a known lab site, bring them to the vessel, and refine a possible cure. Another dangerous trip, to be sure. Before we could solidify the plan, a familiar voice crackled over the radio, someone from the Coalition post, calling out frantically, "Grant, Elise, anyone out there? The camp is under heavy attack from a massive horde. We've lost part of the perimeter. They're everywhere. We need assistance, if you can hear this." Static overwhelmed the transmission. My heart sank. The Coalition post, our home, was in grave danger. Grant clenched his fists, torn between helping our people and continuing the crucial research that might save them all. Dawn arrived with tension you could cut with a knife. Dr. Solomon's potential breakthrough needed more time and more supplies. Yet the Coalition post was in mortal peril. Grant wrestled with the decision, pacing the small deck. If we abandon the post, countless lives could be lost. If we leave the ship, we might lose our best chance at a real solution. We can't split too many people. Either mission could fail. Ultimately, we decided that Elise, Grant, and a few volunteers would try to return to the post in the fishing boat to help fend off the attack. Dr. Solomon and her team would continue their work on the ship, analyzing the virus samples. I chose to remain on the vessel, hoping to help finalize any potential cure. The choice felt like a betrayal of the friends at the Coalition post, but my skills aligned more with assisting the scientists. Elise hugged me tightly before climbing down into the fishing boat. With heavy hearts, we watched the fishing boat vanish into the morning mist. On board, our closest companions were risking their lives to save the Coalition post. Aboard the research vessel, I assisted Dr. Solomon with manual tasks. We labeled test tubes, prepared solutions, and carefully documented each result. Time was critical. The virus's protective shell is like a fortress, but we see microscopic signs of weakness in certain conditions. If we can mass-produce the right compound, we might stand a chance at neutralizing infected tissue. But we'll need real manufacturing capabilities, and those are scarce now. We pressed on, fueled by the slim possibility that this research could end the apocalypse, or at least offer an alternative to nuclear bombs. As the hours ticked by, we anxiously awaited word from Grant and Elise. Finally, a weak radio signal came through. "We reached the Coalition post. It's bad. The horde is massive. We're holding them off for now, but casualties are high. We lost contact with half our perimeter. I'm not sure how much longer we can last. If you manage to create anything that can slow them down, please hurry." Then silence. I clenched my fists, feeling utterly helpless. Dr. Solomon pushed us to work faster, but science doesn't bend easily to desperation. By now, the nuclear retaliation had become a grim background noise to everything else. The captain occasionally scanned global frequencies, picking up partial transmissions. Widespread nuclear usage has rendered large portions of the planet hazardous. The infected continue to spread across irradiated zones. Governments worldwide are fragmented. Some safe zones persist, but resources are dwindling. Citizens are advised to unite in small communities and defend against roaming hordes. It was the same story repeated over and over. Bombs fall, undead remain, resources vanish. If Dr. Solomon's team failed, Humanity's future looked unbearably bleak. Just when despair threatened to consume us, Dr. Solomon made a discovery. She rushed into the makeshift lab, eyes bright for the first time since we met. We've identified a compound that appears to break down the virus's outer layer in controlled lab tests. It's not a full cure, but it might weaken infected tissue long enough to neutralize a host with conventional means. We have to refine it, but this is the biggest leap we've seen. The news spread among the crew, igniting cautious optimism. We still needed key reagents from a specialized mainland lab to produce it in any quantity. But we had a starting point, a reason to believe the world might not be doomed. The scientists worked through the night, formulating a small batch of the virus disruptor. We tested it on infected tissue samples we had on board. The results were incredible. The tissue rapidly decayed, losing its ability to function. Of course, real-world application meant injecting or spraying it on actual infected individuals. No small feat. Still, it was progress like we'd never seen before. At dawn, the captain approached me. We need those lab materials to produce this on a large scale. I'm organizing a trip back to the mainland. It's dangerous, but if we succeed, we might change the course of this apocalypse. I nodded, resolve hardening. We were so close to a real solution, one that might finally do what nuclear bombs could not: stop the infection at its source. Nuclear retaliation has devastated our planet, yet the zombie infection endures. But there is now, at last, a glimmer of hope. Dr. Solomon's disruptor compound might be the key. I'm about to leave the research vessel with a small team, traveling back to shore on our patched-up fishing boat to retrieve the materials needed for mass production. The waters remain perilous. The mainland is crawling with the undead, and nuclear fallout still blankets vast areas. But no matter how slim the odds, this might be our best and only chance. If you hear this broadcast, know that you're not alone in this nightmare. Survivors are out there, fighting for every inch of hope. Stay safe, stay vigilant, and never forget that even when nuclear fire fails, the human spirit can still flicker in the darkness. Maybe, just maybe, that flicker can grow into a flame of salvation for us all. That's all for now. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more unsettling creepypastas. Your support keeps my channel alive. Until next time, stay quiet, stay vigilant, and trust nothing, not even the silence.